My name is Sarah Brown-Campello, and I'm the Network and Programs Coordinator here at WINGS. WINGS is a global network of about 100 philanthropy associations and support organizations in 40 countries across the world, whose purpose is to strengthen, promote, and provide leadership on the development of philanthropy and social investment. WINGS members are supporting a total of around 100,000 philanthropy organizations. We have a special panel with us from around the world today. We have Charles Keidan from Alliance Magazine, based in the UK. Carl Manlin recently moved to Lomé with EcoBank Foundation, and Yanni Peng from the Narada Foundation in China. Benjamin and myself are from WINGS, and we're based here in São Paulo, Brazil. Lift Up Philanthropy is a global and open campaign to raise the strategic importance and value of the development of philanthropy. It is to raise funders' awareness of the importance of investing in the support ecosystem or infrastructure that allows philanthropy to develop in growth, quality, and diversity. This webinar will serve as a reference or resource for this campaign and will offer participants the opportunity to hear different perspectives from this field, specifically from funders today. We invite you to join this conversation, whether you're a philanthropy support organization, a network, association, funder, or potential funder interested in the development of the field. You are invited to use this hashtag, join this global conversation, and adapt it to your own context and own it. Lift Up Philanthropy ties to a number of recent WINGS activities. In March, we had the funders meeting in Barcelona, which had about 70 participants, namely funders from 25 different countries, to discuss the strategic importance of funding philanthropy support alongside other traditional funding areas. In May, we launched the Lift Up Philanthropy hashtag and campaign. You can find more information about this on our website, or you can search in Twitter to see what people are saying. We published the ecosystem paper, which looks at philanthropy holistically and the different elements that make a healthy philanthropy support ecosystem. We've launched the guide, Unlocking Philanthropy's Potential, which Benjamin will speak about a bit later in this call. And we had the June edition of Alliance on Philanthropy Developers, which Charles will speak about in a bit. Alliance Magazine is WINGS' media partner, and this webinar was born from a discussion between WINGS and Alliance. And a special thanks to Amy McGoldrick for helping me plan this webinar. We recently were invited by Alliance to partner on their special feature on philanthropy developers. It was a natural partnership as we both have a shared interest in the topics. WINGS as a global network of philanthropy developers, and Alliance Magazine, a global publication dedicated to building philanthropy literature, awareness, and opinions from the field. So without further ado, I will introduce you to Charles, who will give us a little bit of his perspective on the Lift Up Philanthropy campaign and why they decided to devote an entire month to philanthropy developers. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all of you in this webinar for joining us. It's a real pleasure for Alliance Magazine to be continuing our partnership with WINGS today through this webinar. Just to briefly give you a little bit more information about Alliance for those that don't know us, we're based in London, but we're a global philanthropy magazine and website which is published quarterly to cover trends in the field of philanthropy around the world. Magazine's been going for 20 years. Each of our quarterly issues has a special feature which looks in depth at a particular topic, and our latest issue out in June of this year focused on philanthropy infrastructure and really was a centerpiece of our partnership with WINGS. I've been asked by Sarah and the WINGS team to talk just briefly about three things: why we devoted a special feature to this particular topic, second of all, what was striking about this special feature and some of the feedback we've received, and third, some broader observations about funding of the field in the context both of the Barcelona funders meeting that Sarah mentioned and more generally observations about funding of infrastructure beyond that meeting. So turning to the first question, why we devoted a special feature? Well, we really had a strong sense that this topic, this question of philanthropy infrastructure, was coming of age. At our discussions at the editorial board over a year previously, there'd been quite a robust exchange about why this question really needed a bit more attention, and we in the philanthropy media should be giving it some of that attention. And there was a view that philanthropy is changing, both externally. There are developments that are affecting the development and context for philanthropy, and internally we are seeing the growth of non-institutional forms of philanthropy. So there are reasons, both external and internal, why this moment for philanthropy also called for a moment for a discussion about the system of support that supports philanthropy. And it was with that that I worked with guest editors Bellegy here for the moment, and Masha Chertok, I'm the chair of Wings, and also Kath Russia, on this new issue. And what Benjamin and Masha did so eloquently is in this issue and in their other work is they're presenting now a new vision of philanthropy infrastructure. And it was an opportunity in our edition of Alliance to really reflect on trends in the field and also maybe contribute some new thinking to the debate. For example, debates around the role of umbrella bodies in providing leadership, research, and also raising questions about the language of philanthropy infrastructure, whether that terminology of infrastructure was fit for purpose. And our cover image, which Sarah can put it on the screen now, really reflects an effort to move away from a more static view of infrastructure that's underpinned by roads to a more dynamic view of growth and change. And you can see it on the screen now. Our attempt to, if you like, visually capture the growth of infrastructure. And what was, turning to the second question, what was striking about what we found is there is a very global story that is emerging beyond just maybe certain contexts for philanthropy. But despite that global story, there's still a very strong geographical imbalance in the development of philanthropy infrastructure. 80% of infrastructure is still, I think, resources are in the United States. And to me, that does raise questions about the kind of dominance of a traditional British-American paradigm of philanthropy. If that paradigm is going to be called into question and new narratives of philanthropy emerge, then surely we'll have to see some changes in the way that the infrastructure is distributed geographically. Another point that was striking was the historical development of infrastructure. While I think we're in a new phase now, there are historical antecedents. And in our pages of Alliance, we tried to, if you like, profile some of those infrastructure pioneers that have done so much to shape the debate. And you can read more about that in the issue. Other striking features were the emergence of some non-traditional players who are interested in philanthropy and therefore involved in debates about its development. For example, the OECD, the World Bank Group, DFID in the UK. These development actors are seeing new paradigms emerging and can see the role and potential for philanthropy for a number of reasons, both in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and ultimately to promote democracy and civil society. So their engagement on infrastructure is interesting. A third observation that was striking from our issue was that funders are stepping up to support infrastructure, but it's still not enough. So organizations and foundations like the Mott Foundation in the US and the Narada Foundation in China are very striking examples of organizations that understand the logic of infrastructure, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more from Yanni Peng about that from Narada in a moment. But they're still the exceptions, and we're still maybe not seeing as much movement on the funding side, though I know that is changing, and there's some observations about that on the pages of Alliance. And the fourth striking feature was perhaps the context of a growing infrastructure, philanthropy infrastructure community, people at Wings and others that are talking about this issue. But sometimes actually there's, if you like, sub-communities that are in maybe tension with the overall community. So there's a community of people, for example, thinking about impact in philanthropy, and they're looking at the infrastructure around impact. And there's another group of people maybe that are looking at the impact of digital technology. So you're seeing a philanthropy infrastructure around digital. And how those, if you like, subgroups connect with the overall debate about infrastructure will be interesting interesting. And I just want to end my observations for now just with some thoughts about the funding of infrastructure in the context of that Barcelona meeting. Because it might be the case that not all funders will immediately engage with and get that bigger picture and fund infrastructure as an end in itself. But some of them might understand the value of some of those kind of sub-infrastructure parts. And I just wanted to reflect very briefly on one, the communications infrastructure, which is of particular interest to a philanthropy media organization like Alliance. So we're seeing more and more foundations that are investing in their own communications infrastructure, more foundations employing communications officers, umbrella bodies like the German Association of Foundations that now have 8 or 9 staff dedicated to communications, and we're seeing foundations invest in public relations firms. So on the supply side, you're seeing a growth in communications infrastructure. But what about on the demand side? We know there's a demand for this, foundations and appetite for their stories to be told. But unless we develop a robust media infrastructure that can tell those stories, then there might be a misallocation of resources or an imbalance. So I think there is a real logic to investing in that media infrastructure, not just because we at Alliance are part of it, but because of the wider potential for the positive stories of foundations' work to be told, as well as the opportunity to, of course, hold foundations and the world of philanthropy to account. So it's on that note that I want to end with just a call about developments in the communications infrastructure space. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have after the other presentations. And I'm now going to hand back to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Charles. I encourage everyone to go to the Alliance website and check out their edition of the Philanthropy Developers from June. Thank you. Our next speaker is Benjamin Bellegy from Wings. He will give us a little bit of background on the new resource, Unlocking Philanthropy's Potential and Guide, and how funders and associations can use it. Thank you, Benjamin.
To share with all of you this conversation about why and how we can support the development of philanthropy by investing in this infrastructure or support ecosystem that can strengthen and accelerate the growth and improve the efficiency of the private resources that are invested for common good worldwide. So first, maybe just before talking about this new guide that we published recently in June, maybe why also on Wing's side we decided to turn the spotlights on this question. I think for us, of course, it's natural because we are a network of philanthropy support organizations. So our whole constituency is dedicated to working to the development of philanthropy. And what we see is that despite the extremely important role that these organizations are playing in different ways by building knowledge, by providing data, by guiding the investments of philanthropists and donors to the right causes or in the right ways, and all the work in terms of connecting people, connecting organizations, connecting grant makers and grantees, and so on and so forth, it's still a very under-resourced sector. And for us, the problem is not the infrastructure in itself. It's really more about how can we ensure that the whole ecosystem of philanthropy, giving, and civil society is properly equipped to address the complex social challenges that we can see at the global level, and do we have the right resources to efficiently address these issues? If we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, if we're looking at issues around the shrinking space for civil society, and all the global complex challenges that we're facing. For us, it's really obvious that we need to have a strong philanthropic sector, a strong civil society, and this cannot happen if there is not a well-organized, efficient, and well-resourced and infrastructure. So that's kind of the starting point for the reflection. And since many years, Wings has been working with its members and some partners like Daphne also at looking at the impact of the field, because if we want to raise the awareness of funders about why they should support this and invest in this field, it's inseparable from the reflection on the impact and the outcomes of this field. And of course, it's a complicated issue because most of this work is a very long-term work. It's most of the time is intangible, and it's also kind of collective contribution merged with other actors' contributions. And one of the things that we see that we've discussed in this Alliance edition, and that we've also reflected on in this ecosystem paper that was referred to earlier in this call, is that it's a very complex ecosystem today, with a number of private organizations that are starting to play the role of advisors for philanthropists, including from the banking sector. We have academics also playing an important role by researching the field and educating also future leaders in the field, and this whole complex ecosystem has an impact, but it's very difficult to identify it and to interest also funders in it and convince them that they should invest in this field. So beyond this work on impact, so we did some research. We developed a framework which is called the 4 Cs that looks at help assess the impact of infrastructure work and organizations. We've started to think that we needed to engage in conversation with funders and not only stay in our own group of philanthropy support organizations, but really starting outreaching to donors, to funders, not only to foundations, because it's not purely a good neighbor policy. It's not just foundations, contributing to their national association because it's their duty or responsibility, but it's really about any funder, including development aid agencies, including even, why not, individual donors, how they can help building strong local civil societies, how they can help developing domestic philanthropy, including in the global south, and how can we engage all this broad funders community in reflection around that. So we had a first meeting in Mexico last year around the Wings Forum, and we had this Barcelona meeting that we already mentioned, and so this has really helped us to start defining a new narrative for the field. And so I will encourage you to have a look at the guide, which really presents some of the arguments that were discussed in Barcelona by funders themselves from different perspectives and backgrounds. So right now I will just remind a few things. Once again, when we're talking about why this conversation is so important, I will just remind a few numbers. I think Charles mentioned that this question of the geographic distribution of this infrastructure for philanthropy, which is quite uneven, as Wings research has found out. So 80% of the resources are spent in North America, so not only United States, but not North America. And the whole Asian and MENA continent regions together account for about 5% of the investments. And of course, we know that these are the regions where philanthropy is growing so fast. So there is really a question there about how can we increase the investment in the support ecosystem, especially in emerging market economies. There are some very dynamic infrastructure bodies that are developing a lot of great work in Asia, for example, like the Asian Venture Philanthropy Association or DASRA in India, but it's still really limited compared to the need in such a wide region and such a fastly growing philanthropic sector. So that's this question of how we can raise the interest of funders in emerging market economies to build their own ecosystem, and in Europe or in North America and in places where this ecosystem is maybe a bit more institutionalized or a bit older, there are also conversations that need to happen in terms of how this ecosystem can function in a more cooperative way, in a more holistic way, and how these different networks can be sustained on the long term, because we see a lot of sustainability issues also in North America, for example, where we said there is a lot of investment, but still we have this issue of a very piecemeal kind of investment, and how can funders start working more together to have more structured and planned, if we can say, investments in this field. So these are some of the points that we raised in this guide. But the overall idea is that with this campaign, because we're talking about the guide, but it's more broadly linked to this Lift Up Philanthropy campaign. So really the message is, first, funders, we consider that they need to have an individual reflection about how at their level they can invest in developing and boosting philanthropy and all sorts of philanthropy, individual giving, grant making, venture philanthropy, etc., community philanthropy. So how at their level they can do that in the community, at the community level where they support communities, how they can help these communities set up local funds and develop their own local philanthropy, how at the national level where they are operating, they can help building this national ecosystem and national associations that really make the connections and build the capacity of the field or play this advocacy role, which is so crucial. So how they can do that individually and include that maybe in their strategy. And the second aspect is collectively how funders can have conversations and see if there is a way that they could collaborate to build this ecosystem in a coherent and efficient way. So this is really, I would say, the main idea behind this campaign. So just to conclude very briefly, some of the things that we encourage funders to do is, sorry, not funders because I mentioned already funders, but philanthropy support organizations to do, is that we hope they can take advantage of this opportunity and kick off their own conversations, trigger discussions with funders at their level, include the topic on their agendas at their conferences, write blogs, write articles, because we really hope to foster a global reflection about that. And it's going to be for us a real long-term, mid-term, long-term objective to foster these discussions and try to articulate them at the global level so that we raise really the profile of this field. So of course we're really happy to be in touch with all of you after this webinar to see how we can work together to continue making the case for the sector. So without further ado, I'm going to stop here, and I'll be happy to answer any question you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. We'll have a period for discussion and question and answer at the end of the call. On the screen, you can see the resource that Benjamin was referring to. You can find this on the Knowledge Center on the Wings website. Our next speaker comes from the EcoBank Foundation, which is an Africa-focused organization on a mission. They want to help Africans do more, feel better, and live longer. They are dedicated to improving the quality of life for people across the continent, unlocking opportunities for all Africans. EcoBank Transnational Incorporated, the leading Pan-African bank, set up the foundation to ensure prosperity in the communities in which the bank operates. The EcoBank Foundation focuses on 3 key areas: health, education, and financial inclusion. Carl Manlin, the Chief Operating Officer for the EcoBank Foundation, is here with us today, and he will share with us a little bit about what he thinks Lift Up Philanthropy means and what elements strike him as unique in the global discussion. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Sarah. Greetings to all participants. Building from the points made by Benjamin and Charles, we need to recognize that infrastructure is about people and the purpose that we individually and collectively assign to the changes we want to contribute in our communities. Wings Guide Unlocking Philanthropy Potential and Alliance June's edition provide a strong basis for change. Before I dive into the issue at hand, let me mention how I come into this conversation. I consider that we work at the EcoBank Foundation at the intersection of public, private, and civil society. I joined EcoBank Foundation over 2 years ago with the goal of contributing to the transformation of the African continent through health, education, and financial inclusion. EcoBank is a Pan-African bank which operates in 33 African countries. As a foundation, we focus on partnerships that complement the core capabilities in financial management and digital financial services. Building strong ecosystem imply changes on the way we accept our implicit biases and how we define donors. The African diaspora through the remittances to sub-Saharan Africa will transfer 41 billion in 2018. The changing structure of the African economies implies that there is a larger pool of Africans with disposable income. Estimates suggest that this group represents 350 million people. The opportunity is to provide us with an infrastructure that can support our contribution to a result that we want to see as catalytic. For example, we can end fistula in our communities so that we address women's health and women's rights. Also, we can end neglected tropical diseases which treatment costs 50 cents per person per year. The main challenge is a perception that Africans have of themselves with respect to their ability to contribute to the change in their communities. But there is a shift that we need to document and provide the right structure for. Last week, the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia has called on the diaspora to spare $1 a day for the transformation of the country. Tencent Charity in China, a mobile and desktop donation channel, allows donation for less than $1, and users can pick from more than 24,000 regularly updated individual causes. There is a trusted intermediary with a mechanism that builds trust. Mchanga in Kenya has more than 23,000 fundraisers started with more than 290,000 supporters. I think that the trend will continue in other countries where the diaspora and small givers shape communities by supporting livelihood and sometimes capital investment. EPIC Africa, based in Dakar, is working on an accountability framework that should allow anyone anywhere to contribute as others via institutions that are trusted intermediaries of transformation. But to support the ambition, we need willing and able contributors, shifting their attention from the constant reminder of needs to the promise of a structured environment that will deliver more at a better rate. If EPIC Africa succeeds, we will understand the cost of inefficiencies, such as delays in program implementation. The other point is on mobile network operators. Across the continent, they provided the structures for Africans to leapfrog. Today, about 800 million people can have access to supplemental services, ranging from health, banking services, and access to education. At EcoBank, we are building an agnostic digital financial services platform where everyone can join the platform to transact. It means that the Pan-African institution has a means to make the call from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia a reality. The proposal to every African and the diaspora is that we have the infrastructure to allow them to pay for results in the communities. Of course, through partnership, we need to start from the expertise and strength of all the parties coming to the table. And how do parties seek to leverage networks and connections to deliver in the community? What we might be lacking is greater trust in African infrastructure to be intermediaries for social transformation. But this is changing with private sector organizations seeking to work at the intersection of public, private, and civil society. There are options for transformation. And I think one of the things that we need to start is understanding the context and the aspiration. We know, for example, that in Zambia, and that picked up in the Alliance magazine June edition, despite strong family ties, most of the giving happens in church. That is all true for other African countries. Also, we know that in many African countries, there's a system in place where people are recognized for their contribution to a funeral. In these settings, I think there is room for us to learn the structure that delivers funding and result. So I have 5 points that I want to put before I go into the conclusion. Number one, in building the infrastructure, we must ensure that the end in mind is to do away with the subsidy model so that we make communities less dependent on donor funding, being internal or external. My second point, one way to do that is to have foundation operating in a country in the same sector, let's say health, for example, to engage through the SDG framework so that their resources are aggregated toward achieving a national, regional, or continental goals. In other words, the infrastructure is about the end result and no longer a flag-planting exercise to claim limited success in line with corporate reporting. Another example is that the Red Cross has 1.7 million volunteers across Africa, but they do not feature as an example of individual giving to the community. With 60% of them being young people, they represent a large pool of actors across the continent that we need to acknowledge. Digital financial services platform, I think, are a solid infrastructure to build on for individuals and other groups to give directly so that the community invests where their needs are. I have 3 recommendations to conclude. The first one, building strong ecosystem implies rethinking or rewriting who falls into the definition of donor. The second one is strengthening governance in NGOs and CSOs so that barriers linked to trust are no longer the excuse for individuals and others not to contribute. My last point, we need to start engaging organizations and their core capabilities as an entry point to strengthen the ecosystem. These are the points that I wanted to put forward in this conversation. So Sarah, I hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Carl. A reminder, you can send any questions to the chat box and we can ask them on your behalf. Alternatively, we'll unmute everyone for a discussion period after Yanni presents. Our next speaker is from the Narada Foundation, which is a Chinese foundation whose mission is to build the ecosystem of the philanthropy sector, promote cross-sector collaboration and innovation, and encourage everyone to be a change maker for a better society. Yanni Peng is with us, the Chief Operating Officer from the Narada Foundation. Thank you, Yanni.
Thanks, Sarah. It's my pleasure to join the WebEx today. So before I talk into the details of our learning about supporting philanthropy infrastructure, I will maybe first briefly talk about why has the Narada Foundation entered into this space. Narada Foundation was established in 2007 by a few entrepreneurs and also a leader from the civil society sector in China. And when they established this foundation, they felt that in China, if we look at the society, that we will have 3 sectors: the public sector, the business sector, and the third sector, the non-profit sector. In China, actually, the public sector is very strong, and the business sector in China has grown significantly since late 1970s, early 1980s, after the opening up policy. However, the civil society sector in China is pretty weak compared to the other 2 sectors. So our founders decided to devote the Narada Foundation's efforts into supporting the whole ecosystem for the sector. And so after 11 years through our journey, we felt that supporting philanthropy infrastructure is a very important to build up the ecosystem. This, as I think, the Benjamin and Charles also talk about this. And supporting the philanthropy infrastructure is quite different, actually, from other programs which directly benefit the end beneficiaries. Firstly, because this is very indirect. So normally we support a network or some kind of research organizations, and through them we can support NGOs or the other organizations in the sector. And so we are very far from the end user, I mean from people. And this will make it, I think, more challenging for the foundation to tell the story about the impact, and also is quite challenging for the foundations to talk to convince founders that what is the impact and why we should invest in this this infrastructure. And I think this is also illustrated by Charles. That is that talk about it's very important to tell a story of the infrastructure supporters. And another difference is that to support infrastructure organization, we need a lot of non-cash support. For example, to introduce them to other founders, to contribute to their board governance, and also link them to other networks. However, in spite of all of these difficulties, I would think that to support infrastructure organizations is quite rewarding, because the effects for the are multiplied. Of course, by supporting the organization, it will encourage the new organizations to be set up, and also it will help build up the NGOs' capacity and to enhance, for example, the sector's information and the data flow, etc. And actually, it will be more efficient if we support infrastructure organization compared to support the other program, because the one infrastructure organization normally they can reach and serve a lot of organizations. For example, for the one organization we support, the non-profit incubator NPI in China. They serve, I think, over 1,000 or 2,000 NGOs in China. Through them, we can link, so we can benefit more organizations. It is more efficient. But supporting infrastructure is a long-term thing because the impact it will take time to show. And also normally by supporting infrastructure organization is not a thing that can be done by one founder. Normally it will need cooperation from different funders. And when we talk about collaboration, it also needs a lot of time to for collab, how to say, you need to talk about your views, and you need time to generate consensus. So it's just like if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go further, you need to go together with other people. So it is quite a long-term investment. For example, the China Foundation Center, this infrastructure organization we support, we have been supporting them for about 8 or 9 years consecutively. Every year we will give them grants, and also we sit on their board. And it's the same for other infrastructure organizations, such as the China Foundation Forum and China Donors Roundtable, China Social Enterprise and Investment Forum. So it's all they are all the long-term investment, and we need for the founder, for us, we need patience, and also we need to give them space for them to try and or to experiment, and also to grow. And so maybe I'll give some examples about the long-term investment we've made in the field. In the Alliance June, the Alliance magazine, they have I talk about the non-profit incubators. And also the China Private Foundation Forum, the two examples. China Private Foundation Forum was established nine years ago, and this was its initiative of over 10 foundations in China, and now it has grown to the most significant influential platform for foundations in China. Now its name is China Foundation Forum, and they have organized the annual conference, and it's become a very attractive event for the whole sector, because it provides a platform for the foundations to share learnings and share concerns. And last year, the annual conference attracted about 1,000 participants from foundations and nonprofits, including 200 CEOs and board chairs from foundations. It is very influential in China. And another example maybe I will give is the China Donors Roundtable. And we have been supporting them for over 3 years. And it is a platform for the founders, so grant-making foundations to come together to learn how to make strategy and how to do grant making. And now it serves over 30 foundations in China, and it has contributed a lot to the capacity building of the grant making foundation staff, and also it contributes to some strategy review of a few foundations in China. Another example maybe is the China Social Enterprise and Investment Forum. This was a platform the Narada Foundation initiated with other 15 organizations in China. Now it has been up and running for 4 years. So we keep give a grant and also putting a lot of staff time to help them to figure out their business, and also to establish a new entity to do the business. And now it is I can say it is a very influential platform in the investing and venture philanthropy in China. So these are the examples that we have been supported. And I know that just as Benjamin and Charles pointed out, that the funders for the ecosystem and for infrastructure, still they are very, very limited, and it's also the very true for China. So I'm personally, and also for Narada Foundation, we want to how to say, we want to promote this concept about supporting in philanthropy infrastructure and also the ecosystem to other funders. I think it's definitely worth a try for other funders just to make the first step, because the infrastructure organizations, they are vital to the whole ecosystem, and also the ecosystem. If we don't have a health ecosystem, the NGOs or nonprofits, they will not be sustainable. And so it's definitely worth a try. And maybe some advice I will give is that to the founders, that the founders need to be patient and need to be prepared to give long-term, so multi-year grants. And but I think for the first step, if you want to manage your risk, maybe it is better to join other funders, to follow other funders, to joint fund some infrastructure organizations. And then during the whole process, the newcomers will learn about the supporting infrastructure, and also it is a good way to manage the risk. So I think I will end here and head back to Sarah.
Thank you so much for your advice, Yanni. So now we have time for some discussion and for some Q&A. So I received one question that I will ask now, and then after this question, we'll go ahead and we'll unmute everyone. So if you have a question, then you can ask it then. So one question we have, and it wasn't directed towards anyone, but maybe Carl can try to answer this one, is what are some specific lessons or advice we can get from the private sector in building the infrastructure for philanthropy?
Thank you, Sarah. The first one that I think is key, that when the private sector is approached, those that approach need to do some homework and understand what are the key pointers that they need to start engaging on. Asking for money as a first entry point is usually not a good thing to do. If you come, for example, to EcoBank Foundation, and we need to understand, and we are more interested in co-designing and co-creating than just providing what I alluded to as a subsidy, because we are starting to realize that this model is not sustainable. Therefore, my first recommendation would be to understand the organization, what have they been funding, where they are going, and what is the core mandate and business. Because from a private perspective, this would definitely indicate where to go. The second element, which is about what infrastructure do we have, and I mentioned a few of those that we have on the continent. Mchanga, for example, that is a platform that is starting to allow individuals to contribute. How do we ensure that in the case of wanting to reach young people in the community, we look, for example, at what the Red Cross is doing with volunteers, and our volunteers that are already in the community, a channel to actually achieve more. So building from the existing is often, it will be my first, and I think my sort of key point. Build from the existing in order to improve, instead of trying to create another alternative.
Thank you, Carl. We have a few more questions that we're receiving on the chat, so we're going to actually unmute people and allow them the opportunity to ask directly. Okay, so I believe everyone is being unmuted. James, I saw that you had a question. Would you like to ask?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Let's maybe speak up a little bit louder.
Hello, it's James here from Daphne. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask either the experience from the panel, Wings in particular, or from other participants, if you have found the 4Cs framework useful as a way of demonstrating impact in particular to funders. And if it is useful, then how could that be used either collectively by Wings, or how we could use it in a network such as Daphne, or how we can promote it individually amongst infrastructure organizations. And I think a useful starting point would be to share the impact stories that were presented in Barcelona, if that's possible.
Thank you, James. Benjamin, would you like to discuss a bit about the impact stories and the call for cases that we launched? Okay. It seems maybe that Benjamin might be having some technical difficulties. Charles, do you have any experience? Did the 4Cs come up at all at the meeting?
Thank you, Sarah. It came up to an extent, both at the meeting and in the pages of the June issue. But what was interesting and what is striking about the work that Wings has done is there's been a series of pieces of research which, taken together, maybe lifts the tide for all boats around this debate about infrastructure. So while the 4Cs was a prominent part of the discourse at the Wings Forum in Mexico, by the time we were talking in the June issue, the conversations have moved on to, specific debates about funders, how they might engage, some of the challenges of engagement, some of the points that Yanni Peng was making about, in some ways it's hard to demonstrate impact, and the impact can be quite indirect. So the 4Cs have certainly been something we've been aware of at Alliance, partly when we are trying to communicate our own impact. But I actually think it's simply a tool within a wider set of questions. I think there's a bigger question about the narrative, or a new narrative around infrastructure within which the 4Cs fit. I hope that's a kind of useful rejoinder to James McGowan's helpful question.
Charles, and for those who don't know, the 4Cs is an evaluation framework or a self-assessment framework that was developed with Wings and Daphne members. And the 4Cs stand for capacity, capability, connection, and credibility. And you can find more information about this on the Wings website, the Daphne website, or by contacting me after this call. We have another question that I have received on the chat box, and that is, aside from funders, who or what organizations would be appropriate to engage in taking this conversation forward around lifting up philanthropy and sustainability? Who are the unlikely suspects? So who could help? And I would like if this question could be answered locally. So who are the non-traditional players that we should be involving in this conversation around building philanthropy infrastructure? Yanni or Carl, maybe you can respond to this.
Which one are you, this one?
Who are the non-traditional players who could be at the table talking about local infrastructure building?
I think we need to recognize that civil society organizations have been building an ecosystem which has been often struggling because of a lack of funding. So the question then becomes, what is the purpose of infrastructure? And I think the purpose of infrastructure is human progress and finding ways to connect those that have ideas with those that are willing and able to contribute. And we should not forget that infrastructure probably needs to be built for the small donors, the small givers. The collection of small donations is often much more powerful than always looking for the big ticket item. So for me, the entry point would be who's been working in the community and what have they achieved, and how do we help them to ensure that that infrastructure in that specific community is helping to change the conversation about progress in that community.
Hello, can you hear me? Benjamin speaking. Yes, thank you. I just wanted also to suggest one possible ally in this conversation. I think that the media are very important to start mainstreaming this conversation, which should not be an expert conversation. It should be, I think, embodied in broader conversations around international development, around the SDGs. So I think philanthropy media also, of course, but also more broadly media that look at development questions, that look at social change questions, how they can start taking this lens of building civil society, building philanthropy sector, and how these networks and how this infrastructure is such a crucial player in that. So I think that these are also important allies that could be involved in this conversation.
May I respond to Benjamin's observation about media in general? I think Benjamin's absolutely right that the media have an important role to play in highlighting development and the role of foundations in contributing to it. But it's worth remembering that the media itself is under huge pressure, particularly the non-profit media, the influence of disinformation, algorithms, and the loss of a funding model based on advertising and subscriptions with the impact of the digital media age. All issues we talked about in our Philanthropy in the Media issue last December. So there's even an argument not so much for investment in the philanthropy media as a growing interest amongst foundations and philanthropy in the role of the media in fostering a civil society, democratic society, and a free and open exchange of information. And I think that conversation between, if you like, foundations and philanthropy on the one hand, and the wider media sector on the other is certainly one that we're seeing emerge. Of course, at Alliance, we're just in a slightly different place because we're the media that is part of the media that's trying to cover philanthropy itself. But I think what Benjamin's saying about, the unusual suspects, the relationship between philanthropy and the media is right. The question is how those relationships can be fostered in a way that is mutually beneficial and respectful of media independence and the integrity of the media as well. So that would be my comment in response to Benjamin.
May I give some contribution from about the unusual suspect? Yeah, I think it's based on the China context. In China, actually, the government they are a very significant supporter to some infrastructure in non-profit infrastructure organizations. For example, the non-profit incubators and also some capacity building organizations. And also now they pay a lot of attention to the credibility of the sector. So they will support some for example, the data transparency building, this kind of thing. But this is based on the China experience. That's it.
Thank you, Yanni. We're going to unmute everyone one last time in case there are any questions you would like to ask. Any participants like to ask any questions? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar will be made available on the Wings YouTube channel, Wings on the Air. If you ever have any suggestions for a future webinar, you can email me. Thank you to our panel today from coming all over the world at different times, and we will connect with you afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Just because it's like I'm not getting
RAF.